Hey, Amanda. Good morning. You're muted. I can't hear you.
Just told me that I was muted. It knows me.
Yes. Usually for me, I'm sitting here and I'm doing everything, and then my dogs start going crazy. And my computer's like, you're muted. And I'm like, thank goodness I'm muted.
Yeah, I know it might be good today. We're having a huge windstorm. Our wind chills are down below zero, and it's literally rattling my windows here.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Oh, I am. Oh, I can't live any farther north than I do already. Memphis is not that far north, and I just
Right?
can't handle it.
It's bright and it's sunny, but it is free. It's literally the wind chills are down at zero. So
Oh my
don't go
gosh.
outside today.
No, no. Well, today we're at, I don't know where we are right now. A little while ago, we were at like 35 degrees, which is, it's
It's gonna
cold
be
to
chilly
us.
for you.
Yeah. It's not windy though. So we
Yeah.
didn't have much of a wind chill.
Yeah, we've
Um,
got right now 25 degrees with wind chill at 10, although those gusts are crazy.
oh, oh my gosh. Wow. Well, I'm sure I'm sure it's beautiful up there, but I'll go in the summertime.
Yeah, yeah. When you'll still be chilly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I've been, to San Francisco in the middle of the summer, and I've been up, in the Great Lakes region in the middle of the summer in jeans and long sleeves.
Yeah.
And I've been like, I'm too cold, y'all. I
Yeah.
have to go inside.
When I lived in New England, that's when I lived close enough to the beach. I was like, awesome, I'm going to the beach. And there were whole summers where I couldn't put my feet in the water because it was just too cold.
Yeah. Yes. That would be me. That would be me.
Yeah.
Every year, all the time.
Mhm.
Okay, so I a lot of the time have sort of like this little docent orientation almost like thing, although it's not really an orientation. It's just, hey, our last exhibition, blah, 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 you did this,
Huh?
and I'm not gonna do that at all. I'm gonna
Okay.
basically tell everybody hello. I'm gonna tell them how many people have viewed the videos they made for the St. John's Bible, and encourage them to make more videos for America's Impressionism.
Mhm, mhm.
And then I'm just gonna hand it over to you and let you do your thing.
Okay. So what I was thinking of doing, so I made a PowerPoint that includes all the works of art in the exhibition, but it's only 39 slides because I doubled them up. And so I thought I'd go section by section and talk about the concept of each section and a few pairings. And then, I don't know, are your docents, do they ask questions and are they talkative? Because what I'd like is to maybe at each section say, can I answer anything for you? Or are there any paintings from this section that you'd like to talk about more?
I think that is amazing. Yes,
Yeah.
I think that is a great way to do it because it's still fresh in their head.
Yeah.
And they can better understand why the exhibition is divided up the way it is.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's fantastic.
Okay, good.
And some will ask lots of questions, and you'll be like, okay, that's
Moving
enough.
on.
And yeah, and other people won't say anything. And I see Julie Parati has jumped in, so Julie might jump in and say some things too, which will be amazing. And so, yeah, I mean, just they are an inquisitive bunch.
Yeah.
But some more than others, and
Yeah.
so they will have questions that they know people will ask them.
Want to know. Yeah.
And so they will be like, okay, the people are being admitted and I'm not doing it, so I don't know how that's happening.
How did they get in? Hello.
How did they get in? Everybody's in.
Just to confirm our time allotment here today, because I don't want to talk too much about the first section and then not get time. So, oh, hi, Sarah. Sarah did it.
Okay.
So what is our timing here today? I think it's an hour, or does it usually take longer?
I have it set up for an hour and a half.
Okay, good. Then we don't have to worry about running too far over,
Yeah.
if we have that amount of time scheduled.
Yeah. Yeah, I put us in for an hour and a half so that you would have the time that you needed. And I figured you could go shorter than that if you wanted to. So,
Okay.
hey, everybody.
Hey, I'm gonna run and get a glass of water, so I'll be right back.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Lindley.
Good morning. Yeah, if you guys want to right now, unmute and even maybe turn your cameras on so we can all see your wonderful faces. Hey, Diane. Hey, Bill.
Hi.
Charlotte.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Glad to see Charlotte from at the Docent. And hey, Phil.
Hello.
And Julie. And Kevin. Always glad to see you. And Gail. Nice to see you here, Gail. And Donna's still trying to hide from us, but that's okay.
I'm having
Hey,
some
Don.
I'm having some carpet cleaning done, so I think that the less you can see, the better.
Okay. I need to have like all my floors done, so I'm jealous of you right now.
Well, I need it.
Me too, believe me. So how's her? And Sarah, did I say hello to you, Sarah? Hello, Sarah. I can't hear you.
Lindley, I'm sorry for your loss. It's the first I've
thank
seen
you.
you. You've been through a lot. You've been in my thoughts and prayers.
Thank you. Yeah, my sweet, sweet dad. Good guy.
Sometimes it's nice to know they're not suffering any longer, though.
Exactly. Yeah, and my mom was an artist, so I got this great love of art from my mom, and my dad loved history, and so it all just kind of came together to make me love art history. So
You painted a really lovely picture of him during the service. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts and how he had inventive solutions to things because he liked figuring things out. And like, I took some notes. I'm going to write them to you later.
oh, that's so sweet.
How
Sarah
old?
Mormons.
How old was he, Lindley?
He was 91.
91.
Yeah, so he had a good long life, and it's funny because he grew up in the neighborhood that we live in, Bill. And so I got to hear about tales of Cooper Young from the 1930s and 40s. But it is 10:04. And so I'm going to pretty quickly hand things over to Amanda Burdan. And I do want to tell you first, though, that the videos that some of you guys made for the St. John's Bible, the total number of views, now this also includes the videos that some members of the Calligraphy Guild made for their exhibition, but our videos had over 700 views. And so that's pretty amazing. I know it feels awkward when you guys are in there and it's just like you and me in there making a video and you're just talking to the camera. But I mean, some of those videos had well over 100 views. And so people are enjoying them. And I know I've talked to Phil and Bill about maybe making some more. So hopefully we can get some scheduled. And if any of you other guys want to make some videos, I would be happy to do that. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and I'm even going to just let you introduce yourself to everybody. They probably saw you and met you and heard all about you from the opening lecture, but here we go again.
Here we go again. Hi, everybody. Hi, Julie. I mean, believe it or not, Julie and I have been emailing all morning, so it's like we're finally together. So welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could come and join me for this discussion and for this training. I'm Amanda Burdan. I'm curator at the Brandywine River Museum of Art. And this is an exhibition that has been in the planning stages for so very long, and that is before COVID. In fact, it was originally going to be just a small show at the Brandywine to show off our newly acquired works of American Impressionism from a particular bequest that had come in. You'll see in the exhibition several of the works from the Brandywine come from the Richard Mellon Scaife collection. we suddenly had Impressionism, not just of Pennsylvania, but of significant New England and California artists as well. And so I wanted to show that off. And I have a background coming from being curator at the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut. That's a museum whose tagline is the home of American Impressionism, because it is a boarding house, historic house, that was a boarding house to artists who would come to Old Lyme to form a little artist colony. At the end of the 19th, in 1899 was the very first artist. And so I literally lived, because I lived in one of the artists' homes that was the museum's property, and I worked in one of the bedrooms of the boarding house. I literally lived the American Impressionist experience in Connecticut. And I've been thinking about it for so long that this opportunity that arose and grew quickly from being just a small show at the Brandywine to something bigger has been in the works since, I don't know, it might be 8 years at this point now. But I'm glad it is finally here, and I'm so jealous that you all get to see it first. Today I want to talk you through the general concept of the exhibition and the 4 sections into which the exhibition is divided. And so as we go along, I've made a PowerPoint that has every painting in it, but I just want to show you section by section what my thoughts in putting it together were, what some of the standout works of art are in that section, some of the themes that are both overt, where you'll notice them right away, and others that are a little more subtle that you might pull out. My recommendation is to, Lindley, if we could share this PowerPoint or images or something like that, so that folks can go back and look. They don't have to be standing in the gallery to be thinking about this, so that you can decide for yourselves which works from the sections are favorites or speak to you, or you could do something with on your tours, because there's not a set story that has to be told. We don't have to talk about this artist and then this artist who is the student and then this artist who did this 2 years later. It's about the themes of these groups, and you conveying that however is best for you. So that's one of the things I wanted to acknowledge here at the beginning is this is such a hard time to be a docent, I know, and to be someone who gives tours and speaks to the public. And that's what you love doing. And we appreciate you doing it so much, to be our voices when we can't be in the galleries. And I know that this is such a hard time to be away from your publics, to have smaller audiences, and to be looking for ways to find those audiences again, like the videos that Lindley was talking about. So I hope that this maybe inspires you to do something different than you would have done in the before times, where you'd learn your script and you'd walk through the same pathways. Maybe now you pick a favorite. Maybe now you focus on one artist and the works that they've done, because that would lend itself to something like these videos. Any way that you can help us engage the public, even if you're not doing it right in person in front of a group of, a group of school children, or a group of Rotarians, or a group of whomever might be coming through the museum. So I thank you for everything you're doing on our behalf to help the public, because that's really the theme of what I do in a museum, is talking to the public and sharing stories with the public, and you are the voice of that. So let me switch over to before I switch over to my video, I want to talk to you because we could look at each other rather than looking at a picture of words, about the theme of this exhibition. It's called America's Impressionism, Echoes of a Revolution. And the very concept behind that theme, I remember talking with our partner, William Rudolph at San Antonio, and Kevin, going back and forth and trying to decide what we should call this show. And the 2 things that I think are expressed by that title are the fact that this is a variation on Impressionism that is very specific to American audiences. And so that means both that American painters are painting it, American subject matters are what's on view, and American educational system, the style of art that was called American was changing at this time. And Echoes of a Revolution is, well, it stems back to the concept that French Impressionism was a major revolution in the art world, in modern art. It really changed fundamentally how a system that had been established to train artists, to sell art, to decide what was appropriate art, decide what was, what was marketable, decide what was popular, was being challenged in France in the 1870s by these Impressionist artists who said, we don't need your academy, we don't need your exhibition system, we don't need your sales system, we can figure out a way to do this for ourselves. So in the US, this is an echo of that revolution, because the US art market is going through the same growing pains as they inch away from tradition that they had been working so hard to catch up on. American artists are very used to, from the entire history of this country's art production, it was just a foregone conclusion that you had to go abroad somewhere to get your training, because the training that was available was either not high enough quality or was not extensive enough in the US. So we American artists or American audiences come from a position of always knowing we're catching up, always knowing there's something that is still to be succeeded in. And if you think about the difference between the position of an American art student and the position of a French art student at this time period in the 19th century, the French art student knew that he was living and working in the tradition, that everyone was seeking to do what his country was doing. And he was part of a national cultural identity that was so important. I always love thinking about the 1867 Paris World's Fair, which was a big circle of a building. And it was in Paris, and the very center of that building, the core of that building, was the fine arts. So that's how important the fine arts was to France's identity. And so coming from Impressionist artists who knew they had this history to live up to and wanted to change the system, to American artists who were still unsure of themselves internationally and kind of caught the coattails or jumped the bandwagon or whatever it might be, with a style, this Impressionist style, that came to be so important. And they did it so well that it became hugely popular across the entire country, and it lasted for decades and decades. And it became the style through which American artists felt they could more readily express the American identity, the American subject matter, the concepts that were important to American audiences, critics, collectors, and other artists at the time. It was the vehicle that drove us into the 20th century. And it's like we never got off the bus, A lot of other artists in France, the Impressionist exhibitions ended in 1886, and it was like, next, what's up? What do we do after this? I often call that the crisis of Impressionism, like where you look around and go, oh my gosh, we just broke every rule in the art world. Now what do we do? And it started a cycle of modernism that just kept projecting and kept propelling itself to do something new, something more avant-garde, something beyond. And in the US, we took baby steps, So we're trying this thing, it's French and it's foreign and it's modern, but okay, we're doing it. And it's working and it's successful. And it kept adopting and adapting to what American audiences liked and wanted. So that's why when we go into, and now I'll bring up my PowerPoint, when we go into the first section of the exhibition, you'll see why France is so important. So I'm going to, let me click share screen. And there's my pretty PowerPoint. And I'm gonna make that big. And Lindley, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Excellent. You are all there on my screen as well. So I just had to brag about this beautiful cover of our catalog. If there is an area that you find yourself interested in as we're talking today, as you're reading the labels, I read all the labels again this morning and I am so impressed. I'm like, when did I know all of these things? It's not possible to keep all of this in your head at the same time. I was reading this morning and going, that's a fascinating fact. I guess I knew that at some point. So the catalog can provide a place where you can go and read about a work a little bit more, or read about an issue like foreign training or the armory show, if that's something that's going to play into your story that you're going to tell and share about the exhibition. And we'll get to talking about the painting that's there, but just wanted to remind you about the catalog. And I'm sure we can find ways to provide a digital essay if there's something you wanted to read while you're home and preparing. So let's get this show on the road. So who wants to look at a word? French Foundations is the name of the first section of the exhibition. And from what I've already been talking to you about, you'll realize that France was very important to the genesis of American Impressionism. It is the place where Impressionism came into being. I struggled with calling this French Foundations, or did I want to call this Foreign Foundations? Because as you read, and I'm going to put up a picture because who wants to look at words? And this is a great example because there were so many American artists studying abroad already, just at the time when Impressionism was breaking through. And they weren't all studying in France. France was, of course, a very important center for learning. But one of the things that I like to point out is how American artists also studied in England, also studied in the Netherlands, studied in Munich, studied in Italy, all over the place. And this John Singer Sargent painting from your collection, of which I'm so jealous. Look at how handsome he is, just like giving us, and he's an artist. Look, he's making a work of art right there. He is a work of art. That reminds us that John Singer Sargent was among the leaders of this big cosmopolitan school, this big cosmopolitan group of Americans who were better known for being expatriates than they were for being citizens of the US. Sargent was born to American parents in Italy and raised in Russia, and he has all this cosmopolitan international background. He's like the uber American art student because he gets his training everywhere. But let's situate ourselves right in France for a minute, because honestly, the cultural conditions at the moment were saying to students all over the world, especially in things like those World's Fairs I mentioned, that you really need to get yourself on track with your training, no matter who you are. And guess what? The French have the best training in the world, so you better come to our schools. It's called the École des Beaux-Arts, and it's very famous, and it's very thorough, and it's free if you pass the entry admissions. So already a great deal of Americans had found themselves in Paris doing their training. And the two examples I brought here are really scenes from right in the middle of Paris. Frisiki at the Luxembourg Gardens and Curran at that Paris exposition of 1889. Now that's the next great, or one of the next great World's Fairs that's coming along. So I love thinking about these two paintings as situating our American art student in Paris and looking around and going, what's going on here? Just at this time when the hold of traditional art training, academic styles, the purchase of works of art by the government of France, all of that was starting to be chipped away at as the only way to make it in the art world. Tanner is, I don't need to tell you about Tanner, especially since this painting is in your collection. I love this little group of artists who are looking around Paris, who are looking around at their new surroundings and trying to figure out what's going on. And even though Tanner is not always thought of as first and foremost an impressionist, I think of Tanner and I think about the spirituality he usually imbues in his paintings, no matter whether they are historical or landscapes or what is. So right here at the center, of course, is Notre Dame. But look at the way he's painting. He is taking this moment on a pretty small canvas, maybe even right there on plein air along the Seine, to capture what his impression of seeing the Seine, and for him that has, you know, religious implications, in the moment, in that darkness, with the river, with the streets, with the immediacy of capturing what he's seeing. So even these artists that had gone abroad to seek out training were starting to become swayed by what they were seeing. And of course, I've piled them on here, right? Because the Dixon's paintings are so important to the foundations of this exhibition. I'm sure it's where your visitors, your close visitors will be comfortable starting because they're paintings they've seen before, but maybe you can tell them a new story about how important this painting is. So the Monet here, another evening scene where you can certainly see, if you're trying to talk to someone about how Impressionism was different than that academic style that had come before, the perfection of obtaining visual reality versus the looseness of getting an impression of a scene, of capturing the moment, even quickly, of what the light was like, of what the atmosphere was like. You have a great example right here, explaining to your visitors, you know, what Impressionism was to begin with before you even go into what American Impressionism is. And so very luckily, we have one of the great Impressionists, Mary Cassatt, as also an American and a woman artist. And this is one thing I know you've probably been hearing about, but the number of women artists in this exhibition, I'm really proud of. The works that we have and the lesser known names that are given some of their due respect here are very eye-opening in a way, because if you think about all these rule breakings that were happening within Impressionism in France and then within it when it came to the US, one of the big rules was women can't attend these art schools. They could not go to the École des Beaux-Arts. And as traditions were breaking down, women were finding that they were welcomed in other situations like private art classes, the Académie Julienne, or these art colonies that were popping up all over the place. So Mary Cassatt is our standout because she actually participated in those French Impressionist exhibitions in Paris between 1874 and 1886. She was one of these American art students who had come abroad to seek out training that was more than she could find at home. She was in Italy and in France and in Spain. And she was turning away from the academic system, which had a lot to be desired if you were a woman artist. And one of the things, and I think we have another one by her here, of course, it's the Dixon painting. So you all know this very well. I'll go back to the Virginia painting. This is from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. One of the things that on one hand seems like it was working against women artists with this new style was the fact that the painters of modern life that we sort of come to know as these big heroes of French modernism and French Impressionism were painting city scenes and cafes and cabarets and the demi-monde and, oh my gosh, prostitution and behind the scenes at the ballet, which was not a very ladylike space. And women, especially women like Mary Cassatt, who wanted to maintain their propriety and their position within their family and their society, could not really access those spaces with any sense of decorum. So we see women artists often turning towards not the modern world of excitements and thrills and men's entertainments, but the modern world of women's lives. And so here's Lydia crocheting. Lydia is a great hero, her sister, Mary Cassatt's sister. Here she is on the omnibus. And I see this with a few of the paintings feature portraits or feature figures, that concentration on the face is intent, because there's that desire to represent her and make her knowable. But then look at how wild she opens up as she goes away from the center of the painting. If you took just that window view out the omnibus, that's not just an Impressionist painting. That's like a Jackson Pollock abstract expressionist painting there. This is sort of a concentration in the center and then a freeness as you go out. And I'm going to point that out to you in a couple of other paintings as well. Elizabeth Norse this example is a great way to show, because you can see so close up the brushwork and that patchiness and the imperfections of applying paint to be an illusion. And you see just how juicy and paint-like that the surface can be. And of course, she's showing us one of these tender, private moments in a woman's life in a way that a male academic artist would never have even accessed, let alone painted as a subject. So as much as modern life was talked about as a subject for the Impressionists, breaking away from the traditional subjects was something that our women artists, our American artists, but our women were doing as well. And they were doing it by looking at their own lives. So we start to tell the story of the leading French Impressionist who was so important, as I'm kind of defining it here in this exhibition, because we look at Claude Monet and we see just how many Americans gravitated towards him physically, went to his hometown in Giverny, or where he was living in Giverny in France, gravitated towards him stylistically, did the plein air painting outside like he did in front of the landscape, did the landscape painting like he did, because there were artists, Impressionists like Degas, who was more interested in horse racing and ballet, and other social activities. So looking on a whole at so much American Impressionism, it becomes pretty obvious how important the figure of Claude Monet was in the development of American Impressionism. And if you're looking at our catalog, there's an essay by Ross King that really does a good job of explaining Monet's popularity in the United States. So this very early work, it might be the earliest one in show, 1885, is an artist, an American named Willard Metcalf, who journeyed to France for his training, but happened to visit this little town of Giverny where Claude Monet was living. He had, of course, heard of Monet as this master who had moved off to the countryside. And he went and asked if he could paint in Monet's garden. Everybody wants to visit Monet's garden, right? Even in 1885, it was a popular attraction, but Monet said, no, that's my garden. But he did allow Metcalf to paint in his vegetable garden, which was down the street. It supplied his table. And if you read Ross King's book, Mad Enchantment, about the creation of the water lilies, you'll understand how important food is to Monet. He's a gastronome. He likes good food. And so actually to be able to paint his vegetable garden was kind of like right there in what made Monet Monet. I mean, he loved his water lilies. He hadn't started making them by this point, but it gets to literally, I don't know, there's some metaphor here about the way to an artist's heart through his stomach. The way to Monet's heart was through his stomach, maybe. So I love that Metcalf got to paint there and then came back the next year and painted the landscape you see on the right, which is a poppy scene. Now, if you look back here, I'm going to hope you see my cursor, but just over the garden wall, you see this blush here. I love to think of that as poppies because, I don't know, going by Pennsylvania climate, which I think is latitudinally very similar to Giverny, the poppies bloom in June and the peonies bloom in June. I love, the two bloom together, but either way, we have a view of the poppies from 1886 on the right by Metcalf. And this is a comparison or this kind of comparison gets made a lot, where there's an American artist on one side and Claude Monet on the other, and people say, look, they copied what Claude Monet did. And that's absolutely true. He was the master, and that's how you were learning. That's how you were taught at this time, to copy the master. I'm showing you a scene on the left side by Claude Monet, and there's a little reproduction of this painting right on the label, so that if you were in person, you could use this to talk about the painting. That's Claude Monet's house in both of these scenes. The garden wasn't so extensive yet, and you can see just the rooftops, Monet painting his own house and the poppies in Giverny. And on the right-hand side, you see Metcalfe painting Monet's house and the poppies. And he gives us a little hint, because there's the note on the back that says Maison de Claude Monet. He says he paints it, the view from the end of my garden. So you realize that Metcalfe moved in next door so that he could kind of be in on what Monet is doing. And I've pointed this out in the label, and it's a question that I love, you know, to people to be able to think about if they're in person. Up on this hillside in Metcalfe's, there's just a, you know, it's loosely painted. There's just a few flecks of paint up on this hillside. But man, I think, is that Monet with an easel set up there? It's just a little flash of white. And that might be my imagination, but it's a good teaching point to realize that this is how Metcalfe was experiencing Monet, a man off there in the distance doing his thing. And so it didn't take long for more Americans to turn up. And I'm showing you Theodore Robinson on the left, who's an East Coast artist, and Guy Rose on the right, who is a native Californian. And that's another of the points that this exhibition strives to make, is that these artists actually came from and represented all regions of the United States. And when they returned home after their time abroad in France or in Giverny in specific, these styles spread out across the country. The artists weren't all coming from New York City or Philadelphia. So you see this view that was popular with Monet, popular with the Americans who followed him, of that hillside view down from Giverny towards the Seine, or towards the village of Vernon nearby, that so many of the Americans worked their way through. And take a look at the date differences here, 1892, all the way up to a big gap, or a big span for Guy Rose, which goes to 1913. Guy Rose lived in Giverny for that period, 1905 to 1913. So while some artists would do a quick trip during the summer, or maybe go back for a couple of summers, there were others that really planted themselves in Giverny for many years to absorb what's going on there. So a very similar scene from our partners at San Antonio, Lila Cabot-Perry doing a very similar thing. Now, if we take in and step back and get the 10,000 foot view of this, these are paintings that are surveying the landscape, that are looking around. And there's an artist we'll look at later today, Edward Eisenlohr, a Texas artist, who says, if you can't find a landscape worth painting within 10 miles of where you are, you're not a real artist. And so I love the fact that no matter where these artists are, Giverny, Texas, California, Long Island, landscapes are something that is readily available to all. It doesn't have to be the landscape of French farms in Giverny, but that's where they practice, and that's where they learn these techniques. If you are in the gallery, this is a comparison that I really like. Willard Metcalfe on the left, who we've just met through his poppy paintings, and Lila Cabot-Perry, who we just met through her scene of a farmhouse. And both of these show this small stream, and it's likely the River Epte, which is a tributary to the Seine that goes through Giverny. And in fact, it was this tributary that Monet diverted into his garden to create the water lily ponds. So in a way, I like that I'm looking at a little bit of Impressionism's history here. This is the blood that fed the body of the water lilies. But it shows a very different kind of landscape, from that high above and looking out over the view to a very intimate landscape. One of the points that I think is a little bit different in American Impressionism and Claude Monet's Impressionism is the attitudes towards work. Monet is painting figures in his landscape, and they're beautiful women with, with sunshades, and they're children, not so much children, but they're people at leisure, right? When Americans go to Giverny, they don't ignore the work, the peasants, the workers, the farmers that are there. And you'll see that in other paintings. And it translates into some of the paintings of American work that we'll see later. So here's a fisherman. He's checking the eel traps on the Ept. And again, if you read Ross King's book, you'll know what a delicacy eels were for Monet to eat in this period as well. So here is both a little social history and a little art history on a little river in Giverny. And you can probably do quite a lot of comparing these various styles of Metcalfe and Perry, realizing that each of them have their signature style. If you get to know them, you'll kind of always recognize Metcalfe and Perry, but they each have gone their own interpretation of how Monet painted. So the idea really wasn't to duplicate the exact brush marks of Monet, but to follow his lead and create one's own style. Here is another example where not only we see two different artists, Theodore Butler and Theodore Wendell, looking at the same subject matter. It's a subject matter we know became very important to Monet, the grain stack or the haystack. And in fact, these artists take their own approach. Butler did paint his grain stacks at all these different times of day, just like Monet would have done. The Theodore Wendell actually might be a view of the US, because when he moved home, he lived in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And salt haying was a very common practice, and still is a common practice in Massachusetts. And he could see something of Giverny, of the landscape he had been painting and had been wandering in and working in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And he could transform the salt hay of Massachusetts into a grain stack from Giverny. So there's a bit of a mystery about where the image on the right was painted, but they're both certainly influenced by a subject matter that Monet made famous. But again, compare the vastly different qualities of color and light and brushstroke that made each of these paintings as individual as the artists themselves. And I'm going to look here because I tend to talk too long. So I'm going to stop here with these and just ask you about this section of the foreign influences or the French foundations. It's one of the key ones, so I don't feel bad spending more time on it. But if you have questions about how to talk about France in terms of American Impressionism, I don't know, Lindley, do we raise hands or unmute?
I think people can unmute if they'd like to.
Yeah.
And I will kind of get things started by just saying, I know that everybody wanted to study with Monet or just, hang out with Monet or whatever. Which of these American artists actually had a relationship with Monet?
So of the ones we've looked at already, we know Metcalfe got to have dinner with him once and maybe, said hello in passing. But Theodore Earl Butler, who you see on the screen, was actually Monet's son-in-law. He might not have liked that his stepdaughter, Suzanne, had married an American artist that was hanging around in Giverny, but that was the fact of the matter. And in fact, here's Butler, who married into Monet's family and would have certainly had much more access to the garden, to Monet himself, to private moments at the dinner table. I also think of Robinson, who, let me flip back, you have on the left-hand side here. Robinson and Monet were definitely friends. Monet asked Robinson's opinion of some of his paintings, of his haystacks, of his experiments in serial painting and in light. It's very important to remember that Monet really stayed the course of optical impressionism, of constantly throughout his whole career looking to capture the momentary light, to figure out what the effect on the retina was of this sunlight or that cloud or that shade. And so that's something that Robinson and Monet talked about. And Robinson stayed in Giverny up till 1892. And you'll see here, so this was probably one of the last paintings he made before leaving. And if you notice, his death date is 1896. He returned to the US and did not live much longer. He didn't have an aneurysm, that was Twachtman, but his life was definitely cut short. And so that growing with Monet didn't continue into the 20th century. So those are a couple of examples. Lila Cabot Perry, who we saw as well, became friends. She started coming later to Giverny, and she and her family planted themselves there for something like 10 or 12 years. They would summer there. And so at that point, because they were a very aristocratic family, well-known internationally, because she is the niece, somewhere it's written down, of Commodore Perry, who opened up trade with Japan, and she had worked in Japan. Her connections to Japan were certainly of interest to Monet, who collected Japanese prints and was, it's sort of an untalked about point in this exhibition, how influential Japanese art was to all Impressionism. So that was certainly something that Monet and Lila Cabot Perry would have discussed as well. So we really have the choice, the cream of the crop with some of our artists here, of those who were able to get as close as possible to Monet, or as close as he would have allowed. Because you imagine there were hundreds of artists milling about this tiny little town. I think about how people talk about certain, painters' favorite spots, like the island of Monhegan off the coast of Maine. It's just, you can't throw a rock without hitting a painter there in the summer. And I feel like Giverny was very similar.
Well, I see that Phil and Bill are both unmuted, so I'm guessing that they have questions. So Phil, would you like to go first?
I don't really have a question. I'm just enjoying taking in all this great information.
Well, if you ever need something repeated, Lindley can definitely provide my email address. And since I read those notes this morning, I feel those labels this morning, I feel much more informed. So I'm stealing from my own labels to tell some of these stories.
Okay, Bill, your question?
Amanda, where would these American visiting artists have seen the artworks? Would they see them in galleries, or do they see them in museums? Or how did, since they're picking up all these pointers, on how Monet painted, where did they see them?
Well, that was part of the great breaking of tradition that the Impressionists were doing. They kind of fueled their own art market, and private galleries, especially the Gallery Durand-Ruel in Paris, was kind of taking in money hand over fist, representing the Impressionists, and Monet among his leading stars that continued to be popular long after the last Impressionist exhibition. So private galleries really in Paris would have played a huge role in this. And we should remember that as the movement went on, as kind of traditions were loosening up, some of our artists like Monet, Pissarro, actually were able to exhibit some of these works in the late 19th century salons in Paris. So that bastion of tradition, the salon, started to have the traditions broken down as well. So some of Mary Cassat's works were seen in the salon. So you could go to that annual exhibition, and then sometimes those works were acquired by the state and you could see them at the Luxembourg or somewhere like that. But these private galleries or commercial galleries became so important for collectors and artists to educate themselves. So I think, and it's worth saying that Gallery Durand-Ruel as a commercial enterprise, was the one that brought a big exhibition of Impressionism to the US in 1886. They sort of saw their opportunity for a great big market open up. So the capitalist aspect of this is there as well, and it really was helpful. Think about it today. You can go to a museum to see artworks, but you can also go to those commercial galleries, and that is really entrenched here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got, I know other sections of the exhibition to go, but if anybody has any more questions about this one French section, have at it now. Okay.
Think of something later. So
way to go.
Yep. So we call the next section East Coast Perspectives, and it's partly because East Coast artists are the ones that were recognized in histories of American art. When you do get a mention of American Impressionism, it's like Child Hassam, John Twachtman, and Julian Alden Weir, and three East Coast guys. So I didn't want to discount the fact that the Impressionists that were working on the East Coast, that were artists centered in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, were heading to abroad, but then coming back to their East Coast locations and working in schools there, teaching in schools there, like the Pennsylvania Academy and the National Academy. And they were also starting up artist colonies. So you'll hear as we go along today about the artist colony in Coscob, Connecticut. And it's about a similar train ride from New York City to Coscob, Connecticut, as it is from Paris to Giverny. These little enclaves, we're having a windstorm here, so that was a crazy gust. These little enclaves that grew up in the countryside just outside of cities were something that we see along the East Coast. So I love this painting, which is the cover of our book, because here is John Leslie Breck, who studied in Paris and who went to Giverny and who absorbed these things and comes back to Massachusetts, and he paints the Charles in a way that fools me into thinking it's the Seine or the Epte or one of these other places. More than half of this painting is given over to reflections on the surface of the water, which is the challenge, right, for an Impressionist. Of course, capturing the actual trees, the actual sky, but this reflection of the grasses and the foliage and the sky in the water is even more challenging. And I love the fact that he kind of anticipates in his reflections on the Charles River outside of Boston, he anticipates the obsession that Monet is going to develop with his water lilies, where he looks down into his lily pond, and that's his composition. And he slowly edges out the sky and the trees, and soon you're just looking down into the water. And this is one of the reasons why I like this painting for the cover of the catalog, is because here's a moment when Breck is so on board and so right in the moment with what's going on in Giverny and in Monet's world, that it's almost like he has a thought before Monet has this thought of researching and studying the reflective qualities of water. So I mentioned Coscob a moment ago as one of these art colonies that developed outside of New York City. And you're seeing the Holly House, the view from the Holly House on the right-hand side. That was a boarding house in Coscob, Connecticut. I mentioned I worked at Florence Griswold. That's a boarding house in Old Lyme, Connecticut, that were geared towards artists. And even that was a reflection of the experience in Giverny, where a hotel, the Hotel Baudy, existed. And it was home to hundreds of American artists who passed through Giverny. And some of the traditions of living and working in boarding houses communally, going off to paint together in the mornings in the landscape, even painting little reminders of souvenirs of their stays directly on the wall of the boarding house, were things that transferred over to the US as well. So the Holly House in Coscob, the Florence Griswold in Old Lyme, they're like mini Givernies, where the artists were trying to recreate what they had experienced abroad. And Twachtman is an artist that is often more misty, more moody, more brooding. His colors can be even darker than this, which is another aspect of American growth towards Impressionism, having passed through a style called tonalism, which is another American modern landscape style. And you're going to see Twachtman and another artist, Lathrop, right here, as artists who were experimenting with modern landscape styles, maybe emulating the Barbizon school, maybe starting to think of their landscapes as poetic instead of just representing visual facts. Lathrop actually, he's such an interesting story, and you'll read it in the label. You know, he had some down times where he gave it all up and went back to being a farmer for a while. But after he had a little bit of success, he was encouraged to start his own artists enclave or artist colony in Pennsylvania. We call the New Hope School here. And some of the other artists in our exhibition are connected with the New Hope School of Pennsylvania Impressionism. So you talk about things like Pennsylvania Impressionism and Texas Impressionism and California Impressionism. What I'd love for people to see and understand is that those are all under the umbrella of American Impressionism. And each region might do it a little differently, might have their own favorite motifs or landscapes or landmarks that they want to do. But the place that these things take place, that the artist worked or the artist painted, I tried really hard in the labels to always mention when a place was important, whether it's where an artist was born or where they trained, where they moved to, where they visited, because I wanted the sum total to reflect the vast experiences of American artists. No one ever was born in one place, raised in one place, studied in one place, and painted one place. These are a huge number of influences that fall upon them. And so I picked this. This is from the Brandywines collection, but it's actually very early, 1899 for Lathrop. Look at his death date, 1938. Early for him when he's just teetering on embracing the lighter palette of Impressionism. But I think about this one in comparison to some of those views of the hillside in Giverny, that quality of atmospheric perspective and the fading and the pastels in the distance is something that Lathrop was taking note of, and it was changing how he painted and how he taught others to paint as well. And speaking of teaching, these artists that returned and congregated on the East Coast were great teachers as well. William Merritt Chase and Cecilia Beau, Chase at the National Academy and then later at his own school, both in Long Island, a plein air painting school, and his own school, the Chase School of Art, which became Parsons School of Design, and Cecilia Beau at the Pennsylvania Academy. Both of these artists took their experiences of burgeoning Impressionism and transferred them onto other students. So Chase is here in 1890, just after he's sort of been awakened to Impressionism. In 1886, when that big exhibition came from France, it was like an eye-opener to Chase, who you can see it in his paintings. In 1886, his palette gets lighter, it's peachy and it's sunny instead of dark and shady and shadowy. And he's looking at places like leisurely landscapes, like the parks of Brooklyn were among his new favorite subjects. And Cecilia Beau, I mentioned this in the writing about the exhibition, she probably never would have thought of herself as an Impressionist. She had academic training and she thought of herself maybe as an individual, really. But you can see here is another example where she's so well known as a portraitist that she does spend that attention to detail on the face of Dorothea and makes her recognizable, although it's loose and it's gestural. And then you see how moving out from the center of the face, everything becomes even more loose and gestural and suggestive and impressionistic. So even the artists that weren't devout impressionists following in the footsteps of Monet were adopting these painting techniques and were in turn teaching them to other people. Chase, as I mentioned before, had the school on Long Island, where he is very well known for taking in many, many female students. Sex and gender was not a barrier at William Merritt Chase's schools. And when he traveled the country as a teacher, the same applied. So he teaches in California, where many women end up in his classes as well. Theodore Wendell is someone we encountered before. Remember his haystack or salt hay, whatever it might have been. And here he is in a beautiful work from Minneapolis. And it's got this, both of these paintings have this fairy tale quality that American Impressionism was really starting to be known for. The landscape with figures that seems timeless. It seems like nothing can go wrong. It seems idyllic. Maybe it's nostalgic even for summers spent on the seashore, or when your children were this small, or when you were this small and had a carefree day of chasing butterflies. It's one of the themes that you'll find mounting throughout the show is that American Impressionism was very often used as a buffer against the harsher realities of the world, of Civil War reconstruction, of industrialization, of immigration conflicts, of even leading up to World War I. The scary and complicated world is left out of our American Impressionist visions. They're soothing, they're calming, they're refreshing, they're escapist. I think it's why this show why Impressionism has been very popular, but why it might be popular right now as well. Whether you're looking at it in person or through a virtual video screen, these are scenes that make you forget the troubles for a while, whatever they may be, personal or international or political. And that's something those artists were consciously doing as well. Childe Hassam and Robert Vano here as these signature East Coast artists. Actually, I think after I wrote about this, I think that landscape that Vano is painting might be in France, but it's one of those things where it's tough to tell. Maybe somebody who knew more about agriculture could tell me whether in 1890 the hand sickle was being used more in New England or not. Childe Hassam and Robert Vano both here take not just that sentimental moment of reflection as a subject, but I paired these two specifically. And again, it might be a good comparison when you're talking to a group that maybe isn't as interested in the dates and the history of who painted what and when. Both of these are what we call in art history a rooken figure, a backwards facing figure. We can't see their faces that well. We don't know exactly who they are. They don't take pains to describe so that we can pick them out of a crowd. We're sort of watching them from behind and seeing this private moment. Maybe they don't even know we're there as a viewer. And it's maybe that kind of peacefulness that each of these figures exhibits when they're not posing and they're not thinking of themselves as being watched. These are casual moments that are being captured. On the left-hand side, that's Childe Hassam's wife. And in fact, painted in 1886 very early because he had been to France, but hadn't yet been caught up in what was going on in Giverny. So he's coming to these casual modern landscapes on his own. And Robert Vano, also a great teacher. Both of these artists lived for a period in Old Lyme, Connecticut as well. So they're folks, I used to live next door to Robert Vano's house when I lived in Connecticut. So that romantic figure that we can't quite know, you know where you see this often? Covers of novels, contemporary novels. They don't want to reveal too much about a character because they want you to form your own vision of the character in the book. think of it that way. Hassan and Vano are leaving this open for you to think about who that person is, what their life is like, what they're thinking about, what they're looking at. And it's a doorway by not showing us too much about them. So you probably have seen the Yacht Club Basin on the left-hand side and a lot of the promotional materials. That's our Theodore Robinson, who we looked at in Giverny, who became buddies with Monet and had that short life. And this is one among three in a series he did of Coscob Harbor, that town in Connecticut, just outside New York. But it's the Julian Alden Weir that I think has some meat here to discuss. If you're talking to a group and you ask them when this painting takes place and how they would know that. So people tend to look at the architecture, because a tree is a tree, no matter what year it is. People might look at the style of the painting and say, well, that's an Impressionist style. So they might look at the date of the painting and say, the label says it's 1897. But I enjoy the way Weir camouflages, literally, the aspects of modern life in this painting. So you have, it's called the Factory Village. So you know it's a factory, it's in Connecticut. I think he did the button factories, but I'll have to think about what this is a factory. In the center of the painting is a church. It's a little bit shaded by these branches. Off to the side here is the factory. And this place where the factory is literally polluting the air is also hidden over just a little bit by the branches. He shades it. It's off to the side. You look a little closer and you see these utility poles in the foreground. I missed them for years looking at this painting right here and then over to the left. So we have these strong verticals in the painting, the utility poles and the smokestack, and this man-made church spire here and a couple here, but they are all literally dominated by this big canopy of a tree that's really front and center. And it makes me think that this is where Weir was really directing our attention. And he's literally asking us in a way to turn away from modern life, to find this beautiful passage even in the factory village. And maybe that's helpful for talking to people about how Impressionists interacted or didn't interact with the modern world going on around them and how escapist their work often was. So I want to pause there and ask you about the East Coast artists. I know I talked a lot about two different colonies, Coscob and Old Lyme, but there were many colonies on the East Coast. So those were just two examples. So happy to answer any questions about this first step back into the US.
Bill, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, just a comment, and I may need your help or Kevin's help. The Dixon, not too long ago, featured a local artist from Holly Springs, Mississippi, who studied with William Merritt Chase in his school in New York. Can't remember her name.
Emily Freeman Clark.
There you go.
Freeman Clark.
Kate Freeman Clark, yeah.
Yeah, so we have kind of heard that story about women artists or American artists studying with Chase and what his school was like, and how they went outdoors to paint.
Yeah, and he was, it's one of my thoughts in my essay about how this style really became entrenched in among US art students is partly because as a group, we learned so well. Because remember, we had been told from the beginning, oh, you all need to go abroad and you need to study and your schools aren't good enough. So the US artists are very good learners and very good students. And, I always think a French artist might not say the same thing. A French art student says, oh, I'm born in France and this is my national patrimony. But there's definitely an openness among American students to say, we need help, guide us through this process. And it continues back home again.
Thanks.
So the last two sections of the exhibition actually overlap quite a lot. Impressionism heads west, and 20th century echoes is the final section. Partly because Impressionism heads west in the following years. So these paintings in the Western section are often later in time than the ones in the first two sections. And in the 20th century echoes section, the final one, we really concentrate on things that are well into the 20th century. One iteration, I was putting together only works that were done while World War I was going on. So you could use that as a backdrop. So think about that as we look at these two, which are very, very enmeshed in one another. And just as we were talking about William Merritt Chase providing this school, this service to art students, I'm showing you Julian Onderdonk, who was a Texas artist, son of a very famous Texas artist, who went and studied in New York with William Merritt Chase and learned, not from going to Giverny, not from going to Paris, but from going to William Merritt Chase, how this new landscape style called Impressionism with its American interpretations worked. And this is a painting that Onderdonk did not in Texas, but on the East Coast while he was still a student. As we go on, you'll see how very much his student work echoes in what he does back in Texas as well. And to continue my ongoing story of how important women were in this period, you know, it wasn't easy for a woman artist who had trained abroad and learned new styles and had these skills to actually make a success of herself back home. And many women recognized that and basically built themselves a new system, like the Impressionists did. They said, we don't need those traditional schools and systems. Emma Richardson Cherry founded many arts organizations and was important in many arts organizations. She founded a group in Denver that eventually became the Denver Art Museum. She was single-handedly the cultural grande dame of Houston when she moved there in the late 19th century. So women who were trained as artists also had powers to motivate the arts in their communities. In this exhibition, we're looking at Texas and California, but all over the country as they came home. So this is Emma Richardson Cherry on the Pines. And you see, though both of these are Texas artists, the one painted in Texas, the one born and bred in Texas, they are embracing that loose Impressionist brushstroke. Both of these have that sentimentality and the comfort of being outside of the hectic modern world as they move across the country. This couple that I put together here for you in the slides might be interesting to talk about, because these are both California scenes early in the 20th century. One by Armin Hansen, who I believe he had immigrated from Hungary, and one by E. Charlton Fortune. This is something that many women artists did, using initials to disguise or to not really let people know for fear of prejudgment that they were a woman artist. But that's Euphemia Charlton Fortune. And so both of these scenes, and I'll show you lots of examples of this coming up, where a Texas artist is painting very Texas subject matter, or a California artist is painting undeniably California coastlines. But here's two with these intimate farm scenes, rural scenes that were interpreted by California artists who had great roles in propagating through colonies in California this style of Impressionism. So feeding chickens Monterey could be feeding chickens Giverny, it could be feeding chickens Cos Cob. Even as I emphasize place, I don't want to overemphasize the fact that Californians only painted special California things, or Texans only painted, or Pennsylvanians only painted, I don't know, the Liberty Bell or something. What's Pennsylvania about these things? So this is why when California Impressionism has been examined in other exhibitions, books, it's either all unto itself as just California artists, right? Or when it's integrated, it's only those big special California things like here is Monterey's coast or something like that. But I think there's a real benefit in seeing how our Texas artists, our California artists, were so similar to our East Coast artists in their training and in their brushwork and in their conception of wanting to paint modern landscapes. But then everybody, wherever they're working, has a different subject to look at. And that's why landscape painting was so great to show, literally show how these styles made it across the country. So here's my vacation picture. I always stick a vacation picture in. For some reason in my life, that painting by Richard Miller has always just been so special and beautiful. When I see it in books of Impressionism, I stop, I look at it. It's almost chalky and it glows, and you kind of see the sunlight penetrating through those leaves and the shadows around the edges, even the little cast shadows of the tiny little hedge. I just always thought it was so beautiful. And then I learned the story behind it, and I went to visit it in person. On the right-hand side is my vacation picture from the Feñas Garden, which is the Feñas Mansion in Pasadena, California on Millionaires Row. But these days it's the Pasadena Museum of History. So it's open to the public, and as a historic house, it's been preserved so that you and I, virtually or in real life, could go there and see the very same fountain in the very same garden that Richard Miller saw in 1917. Now, it took a lot to pry Richard Miller out of France after he had gone there to study. He even taught in France at some of those commercial art schools that were available that taught women. It took World War I to literally pry him out of New York, or out of Paris, out of France. And when he came home, when he came back to this country, he went to California on the advice of some people he had met in Giverny, namely Guy Rose. Remember Guy Rose way back from the beginning section, visiting Giverny, getting to know Guy Rose, and then he comes back not to Connecticut or New York, but to Pasadena, where he also taught. And he met the Feñas family who lived in this home, and they held a salon in their home, a very sophisticated cultural set. And so he was like artist in residence there as he was teaching at the Pasadena School of Art. So the rest of my vacation picture is that the great thing is if you visit the Feñas Garden at the Pasadena Museum of History, you can take the tour inside the mansion, and you'll find the painting hanging there over the fireplace. So the painting lives where it's originally painted and tells the story of that family. Of course, right now it's in Memphis, Tennessee. So I'm sorry to the people of Pasadena, but I think it's a beautiful, beautiful addition to our exhibition. I want to talk to you about California specifically. And here are two women artists, and you'll definitely see an uptick in the number of women when you look at not just our exhibition, but California Impressionists in general. Fanny Eliza Duval was really working early, as is Mary Brady, two of the 19th century Impressionists in California. And both of these artists are selecting something that is uniquely Californian, the sand dunes at Monterey. And she was lauded for capturing just the right light of that coastal Monterey. And confirmation class at San Juan Capistrano, there's an underlying, when we look so regionally, there's an underlying pride of place that comes with looking at these paintings. And San Juan Capistrano Mission was undergoing a resurgence and a renovation in the late 19th century as preservation societies started pushing to preserve the history of the colonial mission churches. And they became a landmark that many artists went to paint because many tourists went there and would want souvenirs. So we'll look at one other one here. But this image on the left really adds to that sentimentality that I talked about in other works where, look, think about what's going on there. Those are confirmation candidates, all dressed in white. They have this spiritual purpose. They're on their way into a historic church that the community there is now venerating and helping to save from ruin. Part of the church has remained still to this day in ruin as part of the historic interpretation. You think about the style of painting as almost synonymous with that thoughtful, emotional subject matter that is there. This is not painted precisely in a way that captures photograph-like exactly what it looked like. It sets the mood and the tone for the action that's about to take place in the church. Not to mention shows great examples of California's Spanish colonial architecture. Here are two other examples of that typically California landscape, both in Point Lobos in California, one by a native Californian, Guy Rose, and this could be an interesting discussion. One by a native Californian, Guy Rose, who had been so long in Giverny and then comes home. So I want to think about comparing this to a Monet sea painting, like Port Coton or something like that with these rock formations. And then here's Childe Hassam, this artist of the world, really, who paints all over not only Europe, but all over the United States, bringing his style of Impressionism as he goes. And he's attracted to California because of, what do you know, another World's Fair, the Panama Pacific Exhibition, which is going to be taking place there. So his eyes are open to California subjects. So this is maybe not a contrast of how it's painted, but what is the motivation behind each of these artists? One as a native Californian representing his home state, and one as an outsider, as someone who's a tourist, who's a visitor, capturing it. And how being from someplace, but versus visiting a place, might change how you represent or what you see in that landscape. I can't leave Texas out. The image on the left is meant to confuse you into thinking you're back in Normandy and that you are looking at haystacks in Giverny, but Normandy is not that flat. And it's maybe a little frisson that's going to happen. Like, it looks like Giverny, but it doesn't look like Giverny in some ways. That's Eisenlohr, who I mentioned earlier, said, if you can't find something worth painting within 10 miles of where you are, you're not an artist. I love the fact that he painted his version of something so widely recognized as French Impressionism. But then on the other hand, Frank Ray, and I researched how to pronounce that, Frank Ray, shows us this pastel, chalky, atmospheric landscape with distant blue mountains and these greens and pinks. And man, there's a whole herd of cattle in the middle of it. I often think, what if Monet had made it to Texas, right? What if Monet had visited California? And in a way, we'll never know that, but by looking at these artists who kind of inherited something from him, we can imagine what Impressionism would look like if it was born in Texas or if it was born in California. One of the great comparisons, and I know they're hanging near each other in your gallery as well, is these Texas and California wildflower paintings. You actually could make a comparison to the Metcalf poppy scene we looked at as well, because the wildflowers, the native growing wildflowers, are maybe a less obvious regional significant object. You look at the mission of San Juan Capistrano and you know exactly where you are. But knowing that you're looking at the Texas bluebonnets or these golden poppies and lupines of California or the red poppies of Giverny subtly indicates where you are, subtly gives you location. And wildflowers, as being representative of exactly where you are, were such popular topics, subjects for Impressionist painters because they're representative of the place and they all often have a peak blooming season. So you are after it to get to, oh my gosh, imagine if they had the media that we have now that tells us when there's a super bloom or whatever those are called, when quickly get to the mountains in California and see the super bloom of the wildflowers, and it's spectacular and it only lasts a brief time. in a way, these wildflower bloomings in their brief but spectacular kind of appearances are metaphors. I love metaphors. They're metaphors for that impressionist love of capturing the immediacy and the absolute moment when something happens out in the landscape. And that brief blooming of wildflowers is just perfect. I don't know what your wildflowers are there, but you guys have gardens, and I'm sure you can come up with something that represents your region, your state, your city in terms of the flowers. And I will put this painting on its own because it's so huge, because it literally stands out in the gallery in that size, 57 by 67 inches. So if you're in person in a gallery, this is going to stand out, and maybe you can't ignore it because of that. William Wendt is an artist who trained elsewhere, but made his way to California. And he went through phases of Impressionism as well, slightly more tonal, slightly more brushy. But here in 1917, right, and think about all that's going on in the world in 1917, he gives us an all landscape view. I mean, there's only a little sliver of sky up there of these lush California hills. And when I saw this in Los Angeles, I went to visit it in person. And I thought about this dry, arid landscape I was seeing in the middle of, you know, urban California and the droughts and things like this. This was a California that I didn't know. And so I really appreciate the way he celebrates this greenness, this lushness. When you see it's almost iridescent, the greenness of this painting. And you realize the real love that he's developed for the California landscape in treating it this way. You got that atmospheric feeling of the sunlight and the haze in the upper left-hand corner down to this crisp and clear in the foreground. So that's our move west. Can I answer any questions about Texas and California? And I see we are running short on time, but you know, please don't let me keep you if you need to go. Is there anything I can answer for you about West before I talk about 20th century? All right, let me move on then. I've been talking about this all along, so it shouldn't be a surprise that as American artists continue to paint in the style that they've adopted and embraced and fallen in love with, as have their audiences fallen in love with it, and they've started to teach it at schools, and the next generation is learning it maybe a little bit differently than they would have learned it if they were in Giverny. For instance, I'm giving you two Daniel Garber paintings here. He is an artist affiliated with the Pennsylvania Impressionists, and he never went to Giverny. He learned from William Merritt Chase. He learned from other artists who had been there. But we're talking about a generation now who is forming their version of American Impressionism based on other American Impressionists. And it is still close enough to the fold that we recognize the importance of capturing the atmosphere of the landscape, the way the light plays. Look at the image on the right called Day in June, at the way the sunlight just dapples its way through that tree and lands on the wall of that building. We're still seeing some attention to agrarian life here. If you told me that that painting was in 1937 on the right-hand side, it could be 1837 for all I know, because the Pennsylvania architecture that's shown there is the architecture of Pennsylvania barns and farmhouses since the 18th century. So it keeps us in this state of suspended animation where we can, artists continue to paint almost an anytime, any fairy tale view. In these two images, also both very late, 1915 and 1928, I've got a Pennsylvania artist who is looking still at modern life, right? So we've got the utility pole, the fact that this is a mill building, but unlike Impressionists and post-Impressionists and 20th century artists that came after them, instead of focusing on what's going on inside the mill, the child labor, the poor conditions, that we all know are there, right? This seems like it's literally a harmonious view, because the people and the buildings and the landscape all kind of have this, share the same palette, share the same brush strokes. I think back to the Julian Alden Weir factory scene, and now Robert Spencer has crept up a little bit closer. He is looking a little bit closer at these modern places, but he's still making them user-friendly, and he's still making them places where we can say, that's a bygone era when the mill was still in business and the town was thriving. You can make little stories up, because it's not just about how terrible the mill is and pollution and the aspects of progress that and industrialization that one might critique. For fairy tale views, Dawson Watson fascinates me, because he takes what maybe is not the most universally beloved plant, the cactus. It literally tries to keep you away with its prickliness, but captures those brief blooms in a series. Dawson Watson's, and what a weird name. He's British, we'll blame it on that. But his parents literally named him Dawson Watson, painting these series of cactuses. When you learn about and look more into Dawson Watson, the man was obsessed with the cactus. And maybe we could compare this to the bluebonnets in Texas. The bluebonnet painting, by the way, by Julian Onderdonk that is in the show, used to hang in the White House. That's how representative it is of the American people. And if you heard my lecture on last Sunday, I talked about a Child Hassam painting that's in the White House, in the Oval Office now. And it literally occupies the same wall that the Julian Onderdonk used to during the Johnson administration. So we can reflect on how much by the, not just the 20s, but by the time the 1950s and all the way up to today, American Impressionism has embedded itself in our understanding of what American art is. It just is a fact. These two paintings both even look a little bit forward to something you might recognize as post-Impressionism, something that even where the artists here, Prendergast and Redfield, have taken in the lessons of Impressionism, but have not been blind to what came after Impressionism as well. These bold, bright colors that you'll see in other artists like Matisse. And I should mention, and I've included frames here whenever I can, because the frames are works of art that don't often get their due in a virtual presentation. But when you're in the gallery, they're right there. The frame on the image on the left, the Prendergast, was carved specifically for that painting by the artist's brother, Charles. And so its frantic kind of wiggliness is exactly meant to mimic and echo the frantic wiggliness that's in the Prendergast painting. Both of these are really brilliant and forward-looking, and much later, 1910 to 12, but it appeared in the Armory show, that next big iteration of modernism that turned up in the United States that said, we can move forward. We can start to look at the next big modern movement. Now, just like the Impressionists, when they first arrived, the next modernists were ridiculed and laughed at. But within decades, this was all, water under the bridge. And I just wanted to point out exactly how late the Garden of the Girls is, 1928 to 1930. But that view of Gloucester not Gloucester, it's Boothbay Harbor. I mean, that's probably what Boothbay Harbor looked at in 1828. This Neverland and never time period we see a lot. And, one of the things that is starting to get more and more attention in studies of Impressionism is the fact that Impressionism wasn't, of course, just a French movement. And as we've talked about here today, it's definitely not just, it definitely is an American style as well. But there are styles of Impressionism all around the world. And I'm showing you here Jose Arpa, who was trained in Spain and then moved to Mexico and taught there, and then moved to San Antonio and founded an art colony in San Antonio. So his movements didn't go through France. They came a totally different route. When I think about artists like Twachtman, of course, France was important to him, but so was Italy, so was the Netherlands, so was everything else he was seeing. And so, I just have these two more to show you. And these, when I said the last two categories sort of overlap, the Joseph Kleisch is a very good comparison with the Eliza Duval of the confirmation class, because that's the same church. It shows you how the San Juan Capistrano was, even though it's kind of just represented by the Barrist Arcade, it was such a known, recognizable landmark that the gardens there, the architecture there signified something about California's history. The Helen Turner on the right-hand side, and I know you all have a lot more knowledge about Helen Turner from past exhibitions. It just, in 1920, shows us, even if we didn't realize time had passed, this is not a fashion of 1874, right? This is Impressionism and what it looks like with modern fashion. I look at the woman on the left-hand side, it's undeniable. We're not looking at corsets and long gowns anymore. We're looking at modern women painted in a modern style. And isn't that where we started with Mary Cassatt, a modern woman being painted in a modern style? I'm ending here with these two. On the right-hand side is that San Juan Capistrano mission again. It keeps coming back. But I love these two forward and backward looking paintings. And I believe they hang in the same gallery space in your exhibition. The forward looking space is the Colin Campbell Cooper Palace of the Fine Arts in San Francisco. Forward looking because it is one of those grand expositions of industry and the arts, where everyone is showing off their new inventions and their best of their products from all over the US, all over the country, all over internationally. And one of the things we're seeing here is the electric illumination in 1916 of the fairgrounds. Now, if you go back to your Curran, you saw those experiments with illumination at a 19th century fair in Paris. But look at the future illuminated like this. I find it beautifully ironic that he has this neoclassical architecture that he's illuminating. Think of the challenge of an impressionist who paints sunlight to paint in the darkness by electric light. So this maybe is the future of how impressionists will alter with this widespread use of electricity. But on the right-hand side of Bygone Days, and that title even helps us, makes us remember that so much of the Impressionist work that we've looked at and so much in the United States looks backwards as well. Here's a historical mission. There are old churches. There are places, paintings I've pointed out, where you see and you say, I can't really tell when that is because that's historic and traditional architecture. Both of these are nighttime scenes. So something that was definitely an advancement in thinking about painting and Impressionism was thinking about painting in the nighttime. And then in these, you see classical styles, both with very different representations in California, one about the future, one about their past, one about the ruins and the preservation of the past, one about using the past to forge ahead into an even more modern world. So I know I've gone way over. I didn't stop at all. I thank you for indulging me. And I want to ask you if you have questions about these 20th century paintings or the whole presentation, anything that you've thought of along the way.
Well, I would like to ask you about the palettes, because when I look at American Impressionism versus French Impressionism, to me, the American either looks more brown or brighter green overall.
Yeah.
And so, do you think it's just a difference in in the light of the two places. And of course, the US is a huge place, so the light can be very different in different parts of the country, or just a different taste.
I think what you might see is maybe, might be seeing is my personal predilection for paintings that I like, because I was ultimately working on selecting these, and there are so many factors that play in, but that Miller painting of that lush green fountainscape, I see what you mean, the went of the greenery. I think one of the things that it relies upon is, of course, the local colors of whatever landscape or area, region you're painting. Texas might, Texas, even within Texas, of course, you've got the hill country and you've got the plains and you've got all different places, right? Maybe it's what the artist chooses to represent as a challenge to their color skills. I also think when you mentioned those browns and those, the more muted colors, that really signals to me artists. So when I worked at Florence Griswold, we learned and we taught our public that the tonalist school, which was first popularized there in 1899 and up till Child Hassam arrived, was often called the Apple Brown Betty School, because it was browns and autumn colors and darkness, and it emoted those colors like golden eras and bygone days. And then the story we would tell at Florence Griswold was that literally Child Hassam arrived and brought a whole new color range that people were interested in following. And now I know from studying Hassam that he had certain colors, on his palette, but I am sure that he chose the vantage point he did at Point Lobos, because he could use those colors, right? Those favorite colors, as opposed to looking at a browner or more subdued landscape. So it's both regional, as in what are the local colors in the places that we're painting, and it's artist's choice and preference. But it also has a historical background. Twachtman, you'll see in the gallery, has a little bit of an Apple Brown Betty school left in him, with the golden autumnal hues.
Okay, well, Bill is unmuted, so I'm guessing he has a question. I do want to say one thing for Bill, before you take over, that dappled light, the Richard Miller. I just wanted to point out that to me, when I first saw it, it looked like something that could have been painted from the Dixon Gardens also. And so I was thrilled to see that painting, and I think it fits with the Dixon so well. And now, Bill, I think you have a question?
Kind of a question and a comment. Sunday, you mentioned about sentimentality in these impressionistic paintings. And of course, the title of the show is Echoes of a Revolution. We know that the French Impressionists shook their whole world up when they started painting the way they did. And then the Americans, took over. And I think Impressionism is still around today, but a lot of people might look at this show and call it pretty paintings. Because when we look at them, they're mainly landscapes. There are also people in the landscape, but it's like you were talking about the world events that were happening, that these paintings are soothing, they're pretty, and they're also things that we recognize and makes us feel happy. Mm-hmm. So I'm a landscape painter myself, and I kind of tend towards Impressionism. I like it because of its looseness. Just kind of a comment that I have.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that will be interesting to see as I learn more, as generally speaking, we learn more about other Impressionisms in other countries. How is it used? Does another country use Impressionism for politically charged commentary? Does someone else take off from the works of Degas and really paint the seedy underbelly of the red light districts in their countries? I think this is one of the things that is Americanized about it. The fact that that artists selected this benign Monet, beautiful landscape, peaceful. It suited audiences, it suited the collectors, it suited the artists for the place they were in history, for not rocking the boat, or for soothing over places where the boat had been rocked. One of the things, and it's sort of by omission, you may have noticed how there were no nudes in this exhibition at all, because there was a great divisiveness over how the nude should function in art in the United States when Impressionism was first introduced. It's not like the Impressionists didn't paint nudes. Have you seen Renoir, right? But it's that the early critics really harshed on those nude paintings as being immoral and disrespectful, and why would our artists go and paint those things? But the landscapes, as I said on Sunday, were so well praised that it was like a door opened. And I'm of course speculating on what artists were calculating as they were making their decisions about their own careers. But it seems undeniable that this material, these paintings in this exhibition, were intended to be beautiful, were intended to be soothing, were intended for all these reasons. And that makes me ask why. What's going on against the back, especially in this 20th century section? What's going on in 1924, 1916? What's going on in these times and places that made people want to look at paintings like this, right? And what were their other options? Marcel Duchamp.
Good.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay, no one else is unmuted. I'm wondering if Kevin or Julie has anything to add.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really awesome. And
I know. I wish we could have been in the gallery, because then you all could have.
I can't wait for you to see the show, Amanda. It's so beautiful, and you're going to be very pleased with the excellent work that you've done here.
Thank you. Yep. So like I advised you all, docents among you at the beginning, pick your favorites, pick the topics, the themes, the colors, the artists that appeal to you. And in our new virtual world, you can explore those in ways that you couldn't with a group of 20 people in front of you.
And I would remind everybody, this is a longer run of the show than usual. So you have a little more time to spend time in the exhibition yourself before you pick out, if y'all are doing kind of the tours at 2 thing again, to pick out your favorite painting and do some research on it. And as Amanda said, the catalog is a really great reference for y'all to learn more on all of the work in the exhibition.
Just quickly, Amanda, I used to work with DuPont and I loved the Brandywine River Museum. I try to get there as often as possible, but I didn't realize you had not seen this show, but just the way it's hung. For example, that Paris exposition with the little fireworks popping out, where it's placed, it's juxtaposition to the large painting in our foyer that has the beautiful festival that, you could see that out of the corner of your eye. And I can't wait to go back because I went through quickly, but the actual compositions of each of these, the compositions are so pleasing and interesting. Just these 2 you're showing right now and the reflections, it's a fabulous show. We have to tell all our friends about it to come see it, because you have to see it in person.
It's an opportunity too. The paintings that are drawn together here we selected from all across the country and some private collection works, you know, things that are beloved in their homes, you know, that the William Went painting, the large green one, it was on view in their galleries. The Julian Alden Weir is always on view at the Met. And then some other things that were not being given as much attention, like the Cecilia Bow painting from early on is in the collection of the Whitney Museum of Art, and their curator told me they have not exhibited it in decades because it just doesn't fall within the story they tell about American art. So things get out of storage in exhibitions like this, and it's really a chance to see things you may never get to see again in person.
Well, Diane, I'm really glad to hear that you're excited about the whole thing, and especially the specifics of what you're excited about. And so if you would like to make a little video about that to be a Tours at 2, then that would be great. And so if you guys would like to do little videos on individual pieces, or if you would like to compare and contrast, like these 2 paintings that we have in front of us right now, then that would be great also. So, you know, we can kind of play with what you're interested in and make more videos to put out there to let more people know about this exhibit, you know, for people who can't make it.
And let me just say, we're all learning how to make these videos, but a couple of the things that I know work really well as in are even better in a video than could be in person is being able to put 2 works side by side because they might be in different galleries. They might be far apart from each other. And if you can get your editor to help you out, we have high resolution images. You can zoom in a video on a very small detail that the guards would go crazy if you had a group of people getting that close to the painting. But in the digital world, you can zoom in on that little fleck on the hillside and wonder if it's Monet painting. So those are 2 good things to think about if you're scripting your own video.
Okay, well, I am.
Sounds like the doggy says we're done.
My dogs are done. I have loved it. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming. And I'm very excited about it. Amanda, you've done a great job at getting us even more excited about the show than we already were. And all of you, if you need information from me, I've had lots of things going on in my life. And so I have not given you guys the normal amount of information I have so far. And so please feel free to just ask me if you want information about certain things. Amanda mentioned maybe getting sections of the catalog, and so I can probably get sections of the catalog to you. And so
and the PowerPoint, I can send it off to you, Lindley, this PowerPoint we just had. And I know there are documents that collect all the label copy. You know, maybe you're not spending as much time in front of the painting as you can. It took me 2 hours to read all that this morning. So.
Yes, all of you have the labels, and this was recorded also. And so I will give you guys, I'm going to keep it private. It's not going to be released publicly, but I will give you all links to this recording.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amanda.
Awesome.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Good job.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
Amanda.
everybody.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.